at least from a ratings, viewership, and interest standpoint, don't think there is any doubt that the women's tournament, it not only met expectations, it exceeded it. The championship game last Sunday, featuring, of course, Caitlyn Clark and the Iowa Hawkeyes, alongside the undefeated and eventual national champion South Carolina Gamecocks, drew 18.9 million people. Most watched women's game ever. I believe I saw it was the second most watched women's sporting event ever, excluding the Olympics. So basically all sorts of record ratings and review. No, there's a lot to peel back there and the future of women's college basketball, the future of the WNBA with Caitlyn Clark. But really quickly, I will say I'll give credit to Caitlyn Clark for bringing in the fans. I was out in Phoenix, and as I mentioned in hour one, my mom was in town for the Final Four. We found a bar to watch the game. The place was packed. Everybody was intrigued and interested in the game. And it feels like pretty much universally everywhere was much the same. Did you get a chance to watch it? Was it an event for the Martin family to catch the Iowa South Carolina women's game on last Sunday?
So I will tell you this. I actually went out of my way. Actually, my entire family, my wife and I both did. We watched the LSU Iowa game. And then we stuck around and we ended up watching the USC UConn game afterwards, at least part of it. I don't think we watched all of that. Then I watched UConn and Iowa in the Final Four, and at least kind of kept tabs on what was going on in the other game. And then actually the national title game I only saw bits and pieces of because I was otherwise occupied, but I was keeping my eye on the score and watching things. So it definitely, it proved its point in the moment. Caitlyn Clark is box office. We wanted to pay attention, and we did. It was a Sunday afternoon without a ton of competition. But I think the bigger point is this. This felt like the moment to watch this sport that will never come again. It felt like a moment in time. It felt like this is one you want to have been a part of in some way, shape, or form because it's not going to happen again. Doesn't mean we haven't had great players, Aaliyah Boston, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, who are, the list goes on in, players that had outstanding college careers, Brianna Stewart, whoever you want to mention here, Brittany Griner, but nothing like this. The way this was covered, the way we watched it all year, the various records, the amount of articles that were written, the storyline dating back to the LSU game last year with Angel Reese and all of that, this was just different. And unfortunately for women's basketball, this to me was the peak of the sport, and I don't see it getting back here because you can't duplicate this. You couldn't if you tried. You hope if you're the WNBA that you can catch just some of the drift off of this and carry that a little ways. I have my doubts. I think there will be a curiosity factor early on, but they maximized what they had. They put on a very good product. I thought that UConn-Iowa game was outstanding entertainment. I enjoyed that LSU-Iowa game a lot as well. That was a fun, dramatic environment. It was a loud crowd. I thought the commentary was good. Everything about the product really, really worked for me. And I knew as I was watching it, this is the peak. This right here is not going to be the same next year. There will be some that will come back hoping for that, and it just won't feel the same because Caitlyn Clark, this story, and everything that surrounded it were so unique. I call this the ultimate unicorn moment.
So it's interesting, and by the way, that it's not a knock on women's basketball to say that. I mean, the highest rated NBA game in the history of the sport was Michael Jordan versus Utah in '98. They've never matched that since then. That's not a knock on the NBA. It's just a reality. I tend to agree, and I think it was the perfect storm, as you said, of. It was really a 2-year story, right? I mean, and you mentioned the LSU national championship game last year, but you can go back to the South Carolina game in the semifinal, where at the time, people forget, but South Carolina was undefeated, going for a national championship, going for back-to-back national championships. I believe they had a 70, 75 game win streak, whatever. Iowa's kind of deemed as, well, they got this one girl that scores a lot, but whatever, they got no shot. They pull off the upset. Then you're now intrigued to watch them play LSU. LSU wins. You have the Caitlyn Clark versus Angel Reese stuff that, they say isn't a big deal, but whatever. It was clearly in the moment a big story. Then they both come back. Then you have Caitlyn Clark setting the scoring record. And from the TV viewership perspective, it couldn't have worked out any more perfect because you have the rematch of the national championship game in the Elite Eight. You have Iowa-UConn in the Final Four, which is obviously, UConn was the brand of previous years. It's not so much anymore. Paige Beckers was Caitlyn Clark before whatever. You get the point.
Right.
And then you have South Carolina. So I guess what I would say is I do tend to agree with that. That's not a knock on women's basketball, but it was like this perfect 2-year arc where you knew all of the characters. And one thing I will say, and I know I'm a men's college hoops guy, and so I'll sound like I'm probably a homer, this and that, of like, oh, you just love men's college hoops, so you're trying to crap on the women's game. I'm not. But the one thing I will say is I keep hearing this about the women's game. It's like, well, the reason that the women's is this, and this is because you get to know all the players. And it's like, all right, let's have an honest conversation about that because I'm pretty sure next year you're going to know 2 players. Juju Watkins and Paige Beckers. That's probably it. You're not going to watch Iowa because Caitlyn Clark's not going to be there. You're probably not going to know anybody on LSU because Angel Reese and Haley Van Lith are gone. I mean, it's great that I can name these players off the top of my head, but it's just the truth. And so it's not a knock on the women's game to say this, but I agree, Jason. It was a perfect moment in time. It seems essentially unreplicable. But I do want to ask you, and we'll switch gears. If you have anything to add on the women's game, feel free. But from the WNBA perspective, because I remember talking about this weeks ago with you, is I did see that this week CBS is now a partner of the WNBA, multi-year agreement. They will have games on the main CBS as well as 12 games on CBS Sports Network. And that's obviously the Caitlyn Clark effect, right? I mean, it is what it is.
Yes.
Do you think...
Look, I mean, they already said they're building the schedule. The television schedule is largely being built around the Indiana Fever because everybody knows where she's going.
Do you, and I remember asking you this a few months ago, is this women's basketball's Magic versus Bird moment? The highest rated men's college game ever was Magic versus Bird in '79, and they clearly carried a lot of that audience to the NBA. And the NBA obviously boomed under their watch kind of in the late 80s into the Michael Jordan era. Do you think this will have an impact on the WNBA? Do you think it was just a moment in time for women's college basketball, or do you think the WNBA will be able to add real momentum? Not the XFL we tune in for the first week out of the novelty and then we never pay attention again. Is there real momentum that the WNBA can capitalize on?
No, not to me. I think the only way is if they treat her like trash and that becomes a national story. If the other players are beating her up and that becomes some kind of a talking point, like there's a storyline that comes out of all of this and it supplants women's basketball in terms of what's happening on the floor, she's getting fouled hard and all this kind of thing, maybe that draws a little bit of interest, but even that is more like a sideline tabloid issue. Honestly, and I think we saw it, with all due respect to those that are big WNBA fans, I think the college game is infinitely more compelling than the pro game for the women. And I'm not even suggesting that rises to that high a level. I feel like the one thing that the WNBA will have going for it, and they're going to have more of a reason to write about it now, is that this is just factual. This is not an opinion, but the very staunch left-wing oriented sports media are going to be in the tank to try and make this a thing.
Yep.
They are going to write way more than it deserves to try and make this work. Look at the amount of articles that have been written in the past few weeks and the way that the sport is being talked about as if it's the new hotness. And it's not. This, again, you have to look at this and see, was this a fishbowl or is this something that can be replicated? And the answer is no, because there's only one Caitlyn Clark. Here's what happened. Caitlyn Clark went from being Jimmer Fredette to Steph Curry.
Sure.
She went from a version of, a big-time scorer that couldn't get anywhere in the tournament to a guy that came within, an eyelash of the Final Four. And in her case, she went all the way to the championship game. And you even got the great call and the drama at the end of the UConn game on top of that, and then the New York Post putting out the angle that showcased why that was a good call the next day after we were all up in arms the night before. It was everything about this worked. You had the Peacock game on the Thursday night where she broke the record. You had a little bit of sour grapes coming from one of the old record holders. Everything worked for this story, not to mention the media was in the tank to make sure this worked. And they're going to continue to do that. I just don't think that it has any kind of staying power. I'm not suggesting that's what I'm rooting for. I just have to observe and analyze this based on what I think is most likely to happen.
Well, and that's kind of where I am, too, is that you look at, a WNBA regular season, I think it's going to run into the same issues that any sport does, which is that there are a lot of games, listen, what is the definition of market economics? Supply and demand. When there's a smaller supply, if it's a product people want, the demand goes up, right? And so I bring it up to say, if the Indiana Fever are playing however many games that they play over the course of the regular season, every single one can't matter. It looks like it's about 40 regular season games. Like, every single one can't matter. Now, what's going to be interesting to me is exactly what you just said, Jason. Especially, by the way, because of the time of the year in which the games are played, is anybody like the coverage relative to the interest? I think will be interesting, right? And I think it's going to be. Let's be honest. Like you said, left wing, whatever. It's also going to be ESPN. ESPN has a vested interest in making the WNBA important and good and this and that, whatever. But I bring it up because, to me, I think it'll be interesting if it's covered like the NBA. Like, if you just watched ESPN, and I'm not here to trash on a competitor, but it's the truth, you would think that the NBA is the second biggest sport in this country by a mile, and that it is a rocket ship that everybody cares about.
Right.
It is not. College football is the second biggest sport in this country. And you can go through and literally pick any sport. The NFL, major college football, the NCAA tournament, the NCAA women's tournament. Every single sport has increased ratings. The NBA has their ratings keep going down. And I just bring it up because the way that it's covered, like I said, you would think that it's a rocket ship that everybody is watching and that there's just no metric to prove it. So that's what's going to be interesting to me. Are Caitlyn Clark highlights going to lead SportsCenter every night? And like, is it going to create interest, right? I mean, and again, this is kind of a microwave society, so maybe people will want the 30-second highlights. I'm just curious if it means the Fever are playing the Minnesota Lynx on a Tuesday if people are tuning in. It's no
way.
Yeah, that's
I'm sorry. Call me very skeptical about that. Am I looking at a box score and taking a look to see how Caitlyn played? Yes. I do think maybe I'll do that from time to time. Not like religiously, day after day. But, you know what? Arnie did. Actually, I told you, I had to think about it for a second.
No, I appreciate it.
Arnie attempted to buy an Indiana Fever, like, merchandise, like shirt and jersey. Like, this is in advance of the draft. But couldn't do it for some reason, and he was furious about it, and he was talking about the pricing being outrageous and all this other kind of stuff. And I was just like, wait, you were what? Yes, Arnie Spanier was attempting to buy, and I said, you mean for your wife or for somebody in your family or somebody in your life? You're like, no, for me. He was going to buy Indiana Fever merch.
Everyone knows Arnie Spanier, huge feminist, so I'm not surprised. Okay. That is kind of a wild story. Listen, it shows the impact, but again, I'm just curious. And again, it's not a knock on the WNBA. It's a supply and demand thing. There's 40 of these games. They're played at the worst possible time. You start to look at, by the way, the playoffs start in September. Okay, good luck getting people to tune in during football season. And most of the schedule is June, July, August, and that's not a knock. It's just there's a reason nothing goes on at that point. It's because people are traveling. It's nice outside in areas of the country where it isn't. So I don't know if there's any more meat on this bone, Jason. I am with you. I'm very dubious that it has any type of major tangible impact on the WNBA as incredible as this moment for women's college was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think if this was a peak, it was a very high peak for that sport, maybe one that none of us saw coming 5 years ago. And if they're smart, and I know they are, they should do everything they can to market the league around her as best they can to see whether or not there's a lot of families with a lot of daughters that look at Caitlyn Clark and, want to go out and shoot some hoops and shoot some threes in their own driveway and all that kind of stuff. And you can build something off of that. I think the other problem that you're going to run into, and you've seen already some kind of veiled commentary towards this, is the players in the WNBA are salty, and the whole jealousy factor is already coming into play, and you have the other stuff that goes along with that. They need to all be behind this because it's going to benefit all of them. The only chance that league has in terms of any kind of lasting impact is to glom on to what we just saw at the end of the college basketball. I mean, Dawn Staley was smart enough to say that, right? She said something else that was insanely stupid last week. But what she said about Caitlyn Clark and how valuable she was to the sport and thanking Caitlyn Clark for what she did for women's basketball, that's exactly the attitude that everybody in the WNBA should have right now.
Well, and I do think that's an interesting follow-up that is worth monitoring. Obviously, there's nothing really topical about that, but
not yet.
Yeah, but and I'm with you. I think there will be. What is the reaction once Caitlyn Clark is there? She is going to create a lot of commerce. But based on early indications, because we've already had, like you said, a couple, whether it's Cheryl Swoops, whether it's Lynette Woodward, whether it's, some of the current players, she's clearly created a lot of, to put it delicately, jealousy.